Good evening. This is Mr. Evans. I'm here with Chapter 3 of our book called The Trouble with Terry. Chapter 3 is called Paper Girl. Terry, wake up. Don't you know what day it is? Terry sat up, bewildered, and stared at her mother. Then she remembered. This was a glorious day. In the afternoon, she would start her paper route. This morning, Tommy was taking her on his route to make sure she knew what to do. She jumped out of bed and yawned noisily. Her cereal was on the table and she gulped it down. Chew 30 times, her mother said automatically, but not as though she had her mind on what she was saying. Hurry up, Terry, her brother said impatiently. He was already dressed and ready to go. Terry tumbled into her clothes and struggled while her mother braided her hair. Ouch, Terry grumbled. Do you have to pull? You're the one who's pulling, her mother said. Why can't you learn to braid it yourself? Honestly, the way you grabbed 2 hunks of hair and put the rubber bands around them, not even bothering to make a part first? Terry was ready to point out that when she did make a part, her mother complained that it wasn't straight. So what was the use? But she'd better not start anything this morning. Terry had obtained her mother's permission, but she felt that her paper route hung by a thread, and she had been on her best behavior. At last, she and Tommy were on their way. They raced up the street in the cool, silent morning with Tommy's news bag flapping against his leg as he ran. They arrived in front of the drugstore, while Mr. Spring was still throwing stacks of papers off the truck. He delivered the papers to all the paper boys of the neighborhood there. George, whose route Terry was going to have while he was at camp, was already there with several other boys. Hey, Mr. Spring, George said. This here's the girl's going to take my route. Mr. Spring threw the last stack on the sidewalk and gave Terry a long, sober look. Well, you're mighty young, he said, but I guess if you're Tommy's sister, you'll do. Otherwise, I never would have agreed to a girl doing it. Then, still without smiling, he jumped in the truck and drove off. Boy, are you in good with him, George said to Tommy. He'd sure never said anything that nice to me. The other boys laughed, and one of them said, You can't complain, George. I thought he was going to take your route away the time you threw that paper through an open window and broke somebody's lamp. All the boys eyed Terry curiously. She knew some of them from school, but they were all at least 2 years ahead of her. She stared intently at the sidewalk while Tommy cut the wire around his papers. Aren't you going to help roll them? He had to ask her. She had helped him roll papers before, and they soon finished half of them. The rest they saved to roll on the way. Can I carry the bag? Terry begged. Tommy already had the bag over his shoulder. He looked at her dubiously and then took it off. It's pretty heavy, he said, but I guess you'll have to get used to it anyhow. Terry confidently put the bag on her shoulder. Immediately her knees bent until the bag sagged to the ground. She blushed as the boys laughed at her. Then she straightened up and wobbled off down the street. Come on, she yelled back to Tommy. What are we waiting for? Never mind, Tommy said, grinning himself as he caught up to her. I did the same thing the first day, and I bet they all did too. It doesn't look as if it could possibly be that heavy, does it? You get used to it after a while. Terry found that by shifting the bag from one shoulder to the other every little while, it wasn't too bad. She looked proudly down at the bag, remembering the day Tommy got it. She had helped him roll it in the dirt so it wouldn't look too new. By this afternoon, she would have George's bag and his list of customers. It was strange walking down the nearly deserted streets. It made it seem as though the world, or at least this part of it, belonged to her and Tommy. She told him the way she felt. It didn't seem silly talking about something like that in the unusual quiet. I often feel that way in the mornings, Tommy said. Afternoons, it's different. Sometimes in the mornings, I pretend the houses aren't there, and I'm the first person to walk this ground. That could be a buffalo, Terry said, as a big bus rumbled by. They played the game until they reached the start of Tommy's route. He was very serious about his job, and wasn't going to allow anything to take his mind off it. Terry watched as he carefully checked each address on his list, even though he already knew it by heart. He had had a hard time getting a route because he had been a year younger than the youngest of the other boys. But he had persistently hung around the drugstore afternoons when the papers were delivered. Finally, Mr. Spring let him deliver papers when one of the other boys was sick. When a boy announced one day that he was moving and had to give up his route, Tommy was there. He didn't say a word. He told Terry afterward that he just stood there willing Mr. Spring to give him the route. At last, Mr. Spring said grumpily that if Tommy wanted to try it, he would ask the supervisor at the paper if it was all right. The supervisor said Tommy could have the route on trial. When Tommy found out he had to post a bond first, he went home pale as a ghost. Terry and her mother were frantic, but there was nothing they could do, and Tommy knew it. And then Greg's father heard about it and paid for the bond without giving them a chance to refuse. That was 4 months ago. Tommy was no longer on trial, and he had paid back Greg's father. He was so careful that he hadn't had a single complaint from his customers. If he kept his perfect record for 2 months more, the newspaper would give him a $25 savings bond. That was a lot of money. But Terry knew her brother didn't care as much about the prize as he did about proving he could handle that route. Suddenly, Tommy handed the list to her. "Okay, what's the next house?" he demanded. Terry took her bearings from the nearest house. She looked back at the list and quickly told him the next customer's address. Tommy handed her a rolled-up paper and told her to throw it on the porch. Terry knew this would be the hardest part for her. Her brother threw the papers with ease, and they landed exactly where he intended them to. She drew back her arm the way he did and let the paper fly. It hit the edge of the porch, teetered a moment, and fell off behind a bush. She ran and crawled behind the bush and put the paper by the door. Then she ran back to Tommy and checked the list for the next address. The address meant nothing to her, but when she looked at the house, she realized it was where Miss Marshall, her next year's teacher, lived. She hoped that Tommy would throw this paper, but he handed it to her. "Why can't you throw it as well as when we're playing catch?" he asked. "Throw underhand the way you always do. Pretend I'm standing on that porch waiting for the ball, right there by the front door." Terry took a pitching stance, kept her eye on the door, and let the paper fly. It sailed straight for the door. Terry gave a glad shout just as Mrs. Marshall opened the door. Plop! The paper struck the teacher in the stomach and fell to the porch. Miss Marshall bent down, and for a horrible moment Terry thought she'd been hurt. But she was only picking up the paper. She looked at Terry and Tommy standing there with their mouths open. "Hello, Tom," she said mildly. "And you're his sister Teresa, aren't you?" "Yes, Miss Marshall. And it was me that threw the paper, and I'm awfully sorry, but I didn't know you were coming out just then, or I wouldn't have," Terry said in a rush. "It was I who threw the paper," Miss Marshall corrected. Yeah, it was you. I mean..." Terry stopped because Miss Marshall was leaning against the door jamb, laughing. "That's all right, Teresa. It was a good throw," Miss Marshall said when she could talk. "It will be a pleasure to have you in my class." "Thank you," Terry answered, reddening. Why wouldn't her tongue do it what it was told? Miss Marshall went back inside, saving Terry from further embarrassment. Tommy still hadn't said a word. "I couldn't help it," Terry said. "I know it," Tommy replied. "I was just thinking it could have happened to me any time, and I never even thought about it. Gosh." Terry threw the papers as gently as possible after that. She had to pick up some of them, but Tommy didn't give her any more suggestions. Soon they were at their building, which was part of Tommy's route. Here the papers were delivered flat instead of being rolled up. "That wasn't so bad," Terry said as they finished, "except for Miss Marshall." "No, it isn't so hard," Tommy said. "You just have to be careful, that's all." Tommy went out to see where the gang was. Terry stayed in to figure once more how much money she would make. Tommy had made her figure it out herself to give her practice on her arithmetic, so she still didn't trust the figures. Taking a clean sheet of paper, Terry started all over again. In the morning she had 37 customers, in the evening 54, and on Sunday 59. She came out with the same amount. At a penny for each weekday paper, and 4 cents for the Sunday paper, she should have $7.82 for her week's work. Tommy had said that wouldn't buy a bike, even second-hand, but it was a good start. Just then, Tommy came in and tossed her a paper bag and a notebook and said, "George brought him down. We're over climbing trees," and he dashed out again. Terry put the bag on her shoulder and looked at herself in the mirror on the door next to the hall. It didn't look bad at all. It would have looked better if the bag weren't almost down to her ankles. She stood there looking in the mirror and turning over the pages of house numbers in the notebook. What if she did such a good job delivering papers that Mr. Spring would say, "Well, we could certainly use someone like you to take over a regular route." But she didn't think he would say that, no matter how good a job she did. And all because she was a girl. If he did say it, her mother wouldn't let her take a route anyway. Suddenly, still looking at herself in the mirror, she thought of something nice she could do for her mother. Her mother complained about having to braid Terry's hair, and Terry didn't think she would ever learn to do it herself. Whenever she tried it, there was always a lot of hair left over, and one braid would be pointing forward and one backward so that it looked ridiculous and had to be undone anyway. She found a pair of scissors and cut the braids short, letting them unwind. There, that would save her mother a lot of worry. Then she sat down to read a book, pausing only to make a peanut butter sandwich for lunch. Finally, Tommy came in and told her it was time to go and collect their papers. Tommy took a good look at her and asked, "What happened to you?" She had almost forgotten the haircut by this time. Tommy wasn't sure it was such a good idea. "What did you cut it with, a hacksaw?" he asked. Terry tried to see the back of her head in the mirror, but as soon as she turned her head far enough, she couldn't see herself. She tried turning her head quickly, but it still didn't work. "We haven't got time now," Tommy said, "but I'll straighten it up a little when we get home." Outside, Soupy was stirring an anthill with his finger. As the ants scurried away, he made some crawl on his hands and shook them off over the ruins of their home. "Build it up again," he ordered them. "I want to watch." "Soupy, don't do that," Terry said. "Those poor ants have a hard enough time without you making it worse." "Can I come with?" Soupy howled. Can I? I'll help you. I know how to do it." "You don't know how," Terry said. "But you can come with me if you promise to be good. Go in and ask your father, and then catch up to us." Soupy tore inside, and they hadn't gone very far before he ran up to them. They reached the drugstore just after Mr. Spring had left. Tommy cut the wire around Terry's papers and his own, and they started rolling some of them. Soupy wasn't allowed to help because he was so clumsy, and he was dancing with impatience to be off. "I'm a paper boy," he announced to anyone within shouting distance. "Oh, you are not," Terry said. "You're a paper girl's helper." Soupy was just as happy with this title. "I'm a paper girl's helper," he screamed. Terry covered her ears and closed her eyes to shut out all the laughing faces. "Shut up, Soupy," she bellowed. As soon as she could, she hurried off with her papers, dragging Soupy after her. "Now be good," she told him. "Do what you're told and nothing else." Soupy trotted silently at her side up the few blocks to where her route started. Her customers were in the direction away from the apartment, 3 blocks up and down a hill, then over a block and up and down the hill again, and back 1 block to where she had started. She had been in this neighborhood before, only on her way to the swimming pool. Terry checked each address on her list carefully, threw the paper, and continued on to the next house. Slowly and carefully, Tommy had said, and that is what she did. Whenever a paper missed the porch, she told Soupy to go and pick it up while she went on to the next house. Keeping her eyes glued to her list and the house numbers, she almost stumbled a few times over cracks in the sidewalk. The only time she looked up was when she reached a curb and jarred the top of her head by unexpectedly stepping down. At last she was back where she started and through for the day. "See, when you know how to do it, there's nothing to it," she boasted to Soupy. Her smile froze, and she stared at him in alarm. "Soupy, what are you doing with those papers?" she demanded. He was holding 9 or 10 papers in his arms. "You told me to pick them up," Soupy said brightly. "How can you be so stupid?" she wailed. "You were supposed to put them on the porches, not take them with you. What do you think I was delivering them for?" She was so angry that she began shaking him. Soupy collapsed in a sobbing heap on the sidewalk, his face buried in the newspapers. "I couldn't help it," he said jerkily. "You told me to pick them up. I'm sorry, Terry." Ashamed for having yelled at him when he was too little to know any better, Terry knelt down beside him and wiped his tears with the hem of her shirt. "It's okay, Soupy," she said. "We'll put them back where they belong. Goodness, I hope we can figure out where they go." Putting the newspapers in the bag, Terry and Soupy started on the route for the second time. There was no joy in it this time, only determination and a feeling of panic for Terry, as she wondered if this would somehow spoil her brother's perfect record. At least she didn't have to worry about George's record. He had an awful one. Most of the people had already taken their papers in. Terry went up to house after house on her list, asking if they had received their paper. The people were nice about it, but they asked her so many questions about why she was delivering papers that the job was taking forever. When it was over, there was 1 paper left. She knew she had been very careful, going up to every house where there was no paper. When no one had come to the door, she had left a paper there, and given papers to all the people who said they hadn't received one. Tommy frequently had a paper left over, and she was sure it was all right, but she would have been happier if they had come out even. "Well, we'd better hurry home, Soupy," she said. "I don't know what your father will say about bringing you back so late." They ran part of the way and walked fast when they were winded. Terry brought Soupy to his apartment without stopping off at her own. "I'm awfully sorry, but—" Terry began apologizing to Soupy's father. "That's all right, Terry," he said, even though he had looked rather anxious when he came to the door. "I knew Kevin was in good hands. But you had better hurry home. Your mother was here a short while ago. She was worried about you." Terry flew down the hall and rushed in, ready to tell what had happened and get a little sympathy. It's about time, her mother said. Where on earth have you been all this time? I suppose you loused it all up, as usual, her brother growled at the same time. What happened to your hair? Her mother yelled. Terry threw her paper bag on the floor and burst into tears. I wish I hadn't even come home, she sobbed. I wish a truck had run over me and then you'd be sorry. I'm going to run away. That ought to make you happy, both of you, always yelling at me. She turned and started out the door again. You come back here and wash your hands and sit down at the table. While I'm heating up your supper again, you can do some explaining, her mother ordered. Terry turned back slowly. She wasn't sure she wanted to run away when it was going to be dark so soon. Anyway, it wouldn't hurt to eat first. She washed her hands and sat down. Her mother poured some milk for her and told her to calm down before she started talking. Tommy sat at the table and glowered at her. If you're through eating, his mother said to him, go in the other room. Just because you made a mistake is no reason to get mad at her. Tommy left, muttering as he did so. I didn't make a mistake. I know I left her a paper. Oh no, Terry cried, forgetting she was angry at everyone. You didn't get a complaint. Tommy came back and sat down across from her. I always check, don't I? I check and double check. You know, you've seen me. But Mr. Spring just called, said he was leaving the office when he heard there was a complaint on my route. He asked about it and found out that it was Mrs. Pinehurst downstairs, that new lady who just started taking next week. She saw the other papers in the hall, and there wasn't any by her door, so right away she called up. But I must have left her one. Everybody makes mistakes, his mother said. Why should you be any different? Mr. Spring said the same thing, didn't he? He told you not to worry too much, since it's the first mistake you've made. It is a shame you won't get the bond, but it was an awful lot to expect when you're new at it. But he does check, Mom, Terry protested. And why didn't she just come and tell him instead of calling the paper? Then it wouldn't have gone on his record. Remember, she's new here, Mrs. Seth said, putting Terry's supper on the table. She probably doesn't know who Tommy is or anything about the records. All she knew was she didn't get her paper. And let's not get off the subject. I want to know why you're so late. As she ate, Terry explained first what had happened on her route. That won't hurt your record, will it? She asked her brother. No, Tommy said. I don't think there'd be any complaints about that. Anyhow, they'd go on George's record, not mine. It's his route. But it was a pretty dumb idea to bring Soupy along. I guess I should have watched him, Terry admitted. But I didn't think about anything except the list and the houses. Oh, and I got a paper left over, in case you want to give it to Mrs. Pinehurst. Good idea, Tommy said. I was going to go out and get one. While Tommy went downstairs, Terry tried to explain to her mother about the haircut. Somehow, as she told it, it didn't sound like such a favor for her mother. More like something to save herself time and work. But I couldn't make pigtails, she finished. I just couldn't. Her mother sighed. You had such pretty hair, she said, especially when it was curled for Sunday. Scolding you won't bring it back. But did you ever try hard to braid it? You can work hard when it's something you want, but otherwise you just don't seem to bother. Terry stared at her empty plate and didn't say anything. She felt her mother was right. Well, next time you get such a crazy idea, ask me first. Try thinking before you do something instead of rushing into it, her mother said wearily. Later, while her mother was trimming her hair with the scissors, Terry promised herself that she would think before she acted after this. If only she could remember to think about thinking in time. That is the rest of our chapter for this evening. I will see you tomorrow night for chapter 4. Have a good evening. We miss you. We hope you come back soon.